recording and can play. Because I was saying, Jordan, I actually uploaded 1 year's worth of these recordings yesterday. Okay. And I had not planned to say that while I was actually on a recording, but here we are. All right, so let's get started. This is Kubernetes SIG Architecture Community Meeting for Thursday, April 18th, 2024. We have one agenda item today. So Wojciech.
Yeah, thanks. So I wanted to discuss whether for certain types of features or certain types of caps, in particular those that doesn't change the API itself, but potentially change some actual user behavior, but without changing the API itself. I will mention my particular cap, but I wanted to discuss if it is okay for some of those, or under what conditions it would be okay to go with them directly to beta and skip alpha. The reasoning here is that I believe that there are cases where leaving the changes in alpha for a release disabled by default actually doesn't bring any value, because no one will effectively enable them in the environments where they actually change something. And it's actually delaying us by like 4 months at least. So the example of the cap that I brought up and we were discussing, or we were arguing with David, like we didn't get to consensus here, is the cap where I actually would like to change the behavior of how we handle the requests that are usually, or the types of requests that are served from watch cache when the watch cache is actually initializing or reinitializing. Currently, they are hanging potentially forever if watch cache is not initializing for a long time. I want to basically reject them with 4 to 9. But that's a separate. I don't want to discuss the cap itself. There were other the other example that I found that I think it would actually be valuable was Joe's cap, where we are starting to regenerate or retry to generate the generated name, which is for me also it doesn't make sense. It's already too late because it already went to alpha last release, but I think that it doesn't bring any value to keep that at alpha. And I found 7 caps that I linked to the agenda doc where we actually went directly to beta. I think even not all of them were actually strictly meeting the criteria of not changing the API. There was at least one that I've seen where we actually were adding an annotation, which is probably a little bit more controversial, but we did that already. So I wanted to I wanted to hear your thoughts, whether and under what conditions potentially it actually it makes sense. And yes, David, I think it's worth for you to share your concerns.
Yeah, so I think that it is reasonable for us to introduce features in alpha, and for the people who are interested in those features to confirm that the alpha feature achieves its goals in the narrow case that they're interested in before we turn it on in beta, which is widely used in many, maybe even most production clusters, simply because the people who are interested in the feature aren't willing to try it in the first release. I don't think that's a good enough reason. I think in my case, I would be biased to go in the other direction and say, we're introduced it as an alpha, and until you, interested party who wants to use it, have actually tried it and made sure that it achieves its goals, we will not subject our entire fleet to this change. And so I think that an assessment of going directly to beta should primarily be made based on risk. If we decide that the risk of having this thing in alpha is somehow worse than having it in beta, then on balance, we could do that. And I think of one example in the past where it was a label on namespaces. And the risk of, as I recall it, like an inverted match was very bad. And the biggest risk of that feature. So that's where my thoughts are and why I don't think that going straight to beta is appropriate.
So yeah, so I wanted to respond to that, like, for this particular feature, we will certainly, I agree that we certainly want to try this feature, but realistically speaking, we will not enable it in production anyway. We will not enable it for production clusters. So how we would test it is effectively we would create our own like tests. We will run like the test clusters and verify both like somehow automatically or manually this feature, and we can do that. Like I'm absolutely fine with adding more criteria to tests, manual tests, and all of that to the as a requirement. But like realistically speaking, like we would do exactly the same, and like we will not have like more, and I think in many cases it would be the same. Like um or maybe I will ask Joe, do you plan anything specific regarding like the feature before we go beta that we couldn't do like in alpha itself?
For retry generate name, I don't really have a plan yet. It's an interesting cut because it's not really supposed to change the API, but I wrote a CUP anyways for transparency, and because it was feature gateable, I adhered to that. But no, I don't really have any plan.
So look, there's some class of changes that we make that are obviously bug fixes, and we don't feature gate those, right? Because it didn't do what it was supposed to do. So we can inspect it, we can look at it. They're not even always trivial changes, but we look at it, we decide this is good, it's well tested, and it fixes a behavioral issue that is a problem. And there's clearly a set of changes that we make that are so interesting that we do feature gate them because we won't really have confidence until, like David says, we get some real actual feedback from it. Somewhere between those two, there's an elbow. And I don't know really what the criteria to describe that elbow is, but I could make an argument in both directions on this one in particular. This was a bug. It always should have been retrying generate name. The fact that it wasn't was like kind of horrible. We got away with it for a long time, but somebody finally hit a use case that really exposed the bug, so we fixed the bug. Is it a scary enough implementation to justify that change? That's that criteria for the elbow.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Like, what are those criteria, and do we just do it on a case-by-case basis, or do we have written criteria for that? Is one question. Another thing that I wonder about is if we're missing some primitives, some features here, functionality here that would be useful. Like if I were doing this, like, what we tend to do internally, right, is if you've got a fleet and you want to test out some feature, you're going to roll it out, or like when we do upgrades, like maybe we upgrade 1% of the fleet and we do a soak and we check the metrics and we see if things are still working, and then we go to 5%, 10%. We roll out over a few days slowly. We haven't built the functionality because feature gates are kind of painful, and certainly in GKE's case, the way we intentionally restrict alpha so that people don't unintentionally rely on them in production. Like, I'm wondering if we're missing a primitive for our fleet management folks of how to enable some behavior, because this isn't a feature in the sense like even the one Wojciech's talking about, it's not a feature in the sense of like, there's some new functionality I want to try out. I just want to make sure I'm not breaking anything. I want to make sure that I'm not causing a degradation in performance, right? I'm not changing behavior. I'm actually not changing behavior, other than maybe, I guess, if there were things that were we are changing behavior here in Wojciech's particular case because we're rejecting things that before would hang. But like, there's a missing piece is what I'm trying to get at. There's some missing thing that our cluster administrators need to do that we're not providing, and maybe not just our cluster administrators, our fleet administrators need to do that we're not providing enough. Maybe it's runtime enablement of feature gates, as opposed to having to restart components. Maybe that's too hard. Like I don't know what it is, but that's my suggestion, is that maybe we're missing some basic function here. And that's why we're struggling with the concept that we can't implement that. Right.
I think I'm up. I agree with the spectrum that Tim talked about. Like, we have bug fix things, and we have a lot of bug fixes. We changed a lot of things in each release without gates. Sometimes we have a bug fix where we're unsure about the ripples of it, or it's a big enough change, and we do actually put preventative gates around it. And so, like, the generate name thing, I think, is a good example of that. Like, it only kicks in what was already an error case. But the way it reacts may be like super problematic in like edge cases. And so we want to have a way to mitigate that if we get out in the wild and realize, oh, wait, no, this was actually bad. And so, like, we're using gates as a mitigation mechanism for things we are not 100% sure of, like the long tail of weird interactions on. And it seems like just because someone was like, I should write a KEP about this, it's like, oh, well, now it's a feature, and now you must go through like an alpha beta off on, like, whether or not they wrote a KEP. Like, there are a lot of changes that go in that, like, sort of a judgment call. Is this a KEP? Is this not a KEP? I don't know. Let's be a good citizen and write a KEP. And I hate to punish people who are good citizens and write a KEP and be like, oh, well, now you must be alpha and then you must be beta. Where really what we wanted people to do was like have a mitigation mechanism. For the, like, now we're sort of talking about specific changes, like the cache, like start replying with 429s when we used to reply with a different thing. Like, I'm actually a lot less sure about that specific change. And so I'm not sure if what we're talking about here is the alpha beta thing, or if what we're talking about is an opt-in versus an opt-out thing. Like, if it doesn't expand API surface and having it on and then rolling it off, like, doesn't leave bad data in the system, some of the things that have persisted data, like, would starting it as beta but off by default so that people who care can opt in for, like, I am unsure about exposing everybody to this new behavior by default. But if the concern is, oh, we don't want it to be labeled as alpha because then it has the taint of being unstable, so we want to call it beta because, to our knowledge, it is, like, we're not going to improve stability of it that we know of. I don't know. Like, we conflate a lot of things in gates: mitigation mechanisms, stability, feature phase, and we use them in a lot of different ways, and I'm not sure it always makes sense. That's a lot of talking. My main question is, for this particular thing, what about beta but off by default? And can we rationalize why we would choose that for some things and not for other things?
So I think I'm up next. I certainly agree there's a spectrum. I recognize that we do a lot of changes. In this particular case, I am concerned about having this suddenly be new behavior for all existing clusters. And I know that in mine, it would be production behavior because we do not disable beta features by default. And I think that's common behavior. I think most people do not turn beta features off.
Does that mean you automatically enable all beta features, or you go with default states?
Go with the system defaults. Go with the cube defaults.
Yeah.
And so I think that the vast majority of production clusters do that. And I'm not comfortable with that happening. Like I look at this change, I see the change to 429s. That concerns me a little bit. I see the changes to readiness based on the status of resources that may never even be requested in this state. And that worries me quite a bit, because it can take an isolated problem that was an issue on a very large cluster and make the solution to that be, I won't say catastrophic, but losing a QAPI server that never becomes ready, which is pretty severe. And I want to avoid that consequence. So I want to choose it to be off by default. Now, I'm not clear how, and I guess this might be a Googleism where it's like, if it's off by default but called beta, we can turn it on in a production cluster to try it, which I don't quite understand. So I don't understand how it puts you, Wojtek, in a different spot, for instance. But before going on by default, I would want to actually hear that it works. And that's where I think this particular one is on the spectrum. And I would contrast that with the one that we've done in the past for I'm pretty sure the labels on namespaces so that they were easier to select. And say the retry, where I wanted the gate for the ability to disable in case something went wrong. But it was simple and contained enough that I wasn't worried about it. Those are my thoughts. And I think you're next, Wojtek.
Yeah, so definitely like something that I guess I think we all agree, but I wanted to make sure, like, no one is proposing to avoiding feature gates in any of those cases. Like, I think like being able to disable the feature is like critical here. I think I have two thoughts. Like, one is like I think disabled by default, I don't think it like changes that much. I think like it makes it cleaner that like we are not afraid of stability itself, but like as you all mentioned, like I don't think like people will enable it really. And because of that, like I don't think like we can have exactly the same this like discussion, like are we ready for GA at some point? Like if we didn't try it in production, I think like David, you will not be convinced, which kind of like transitively we will never be ready for that, like because like we will run some tests, but like are those good enough for you? This is like questionable and so on. Like we will test it in like on large clusters and so on, but we can do that now. I mean, as soon as it's like implemented and works. I have a POC that kind of works, but there are bugs there. So and my second thought was like I think we are if we don't do it's a weak argument, I admit that, but like I'm afraid that like we may, like if we start like forcing everyone to go through alpha, beta, GA, I think it's in some cases it will happen that people will just stop writing caps for that, and like for in some cases like we will catch them and ask them to write cap, and in some cases we may not catch it and like it will just go, and this would be like effectively a like even worse situation than now. Yeah, I'm not sure. I think John, you are next. You are muted.
You're mute, John.
Thank you. Yes, I actually just wanted to reiterate what you just said and what Jordan brought up, that like we don't want to punish people that make, like, people use caps for a lot of things. One of the main things they use it for is to facilitate visibility and discussion and make sure that what we're doing is the right thing. I don't think we probably should think about like just having a cap shouldn't mean you automatically need to go through all three alpha, beta, GA stages, because I do agree people will just, it'll make things more dangerous. People will do things to avoid the cap. We already have issues with people, caps being a little painful. So I think we do have the flexibility to say beta and off by default, and that maybe makes it a little more likely. It's just another state, like from a Google standpoint, it does make it so that we could enable it in production clusters, whereas we couldn't enable alpha things in production clusters. So in that sense, it maybe gives us more flexibility without having to change how we manage alpha clusters. But beyond that, it's kind of semantics, what states you have here and how quickly you advance through them. The main thing is when it turns on by default. That's the main piece. And I am a little wary of the idea of turning on by default some behavior change with only synthetic tests, like without live production tests. Although, there's lots of changes that go in to do that. So I don't know.
So I wrote in the chat, but I was kidding, but maybe I'm not kidding. Like, gate's a really big hammer. Like asking a user, go turn this feature gate on for your whole production cluster, all of the traffic and all of the API operations is kind of daunting. Like, no, thank you. Like, let somebody else go first. Are we maybe doing the wrong thing with gates? Like, do we need something that is a finer granule than gate, like an experiment? Hey, turn this on for 1% of API operations, and you have to note which API, which experiments you were subject to. I mean, I don't know. I see Jordan cringing, but I don't exactly know how to position it. But we're not getting the feedback from alpha or from beta off by default. Like, honestly, like we're just not going to get feedback.
That's what I was trying to say earlier. Like, are we missing some primitive, right? Like, because people aren't using the ones we have. They're probably not the right things.
And this level of paranoia is going to end up in paralysis, or is ending up in paralysis.
I think I'm next. I want to push on what Wojtek said. Like, to me, it's about like the opt-in, and then before you go to opt-out, and there's evidence before you get to opt-out. And like the alpha beta thing is a convenient shorthand for like alpha's off by default, beta's usually on by default. Like, okay, I think that's a reasonable starting point for most things. In this case, I think it's important to have an opt-out, or sorry, I think it's important for the first version to be opt-in. Like you say, Tim, like setting feature gates is daunting. Putting new behavior instantly onto everybody in the community and saying, oh, but it's fine. If you need to mitigate it, you can opt out. Like, it's daunting. If we want this, we being Google, GKE, we should be willing to turn on the feature gate and then take the evidence from running it in our fleet on 131 or whatever and come back and say, we ran it in our fleet. Here's the issues we saw. Here's the issues we didn't see. We didn't have any problems at all, or we did, and here's how we fixed them. Like, if we want it and it's beta but off by default, we can, like, from our perspective, we get the change that we wanted and we can opt in, and it doesn't put the rest of the community at risk. And then we can bring the evidence from that back to the community and say, yeah, we turned it on thousands of clusters and it was totally fine. But I don't think it's reasonable to take a change that we can actually find pretty easy ways to say, like, if the cluster's in this state or they have an API in this state, this will cause this problem. How prevalent is that? Like, I don't know. But it's pretty easy on this one to say, like, there's scenarios where this makes things worse, I think. So I think opt in first before there's evidence to make it opt out is necessary.
just to be clear though, Jordan, you're advocating for this specific 429 feature, not all such features, right? Like, let's compare both the retry and the 429 watch.
Yeah.
Retry was, I'm sorry. I was there. I think I weighed in on that one. Like, retry was a bug fix that had potential consequences that might need to be mitigated.
Yeah.
But it was not a change where you could look and say, there is this small risk that already exists, and we are going to introduce a potentially a wider range of clusters to a smaller risk on balance.
I think the question I always ask is there a thing that used to work that this behavior change will make not work anymore? And with generate name, we think the answer is no. Like, if it works, if this change does what we expect, only things that previously failed will now start working and nothing else will be affected. That's our expectation of the behavior change. With the watch cache 429 thing, the answer is absolutely yes. Like, I used to be able to bring up a server and make unrelated, like, it would get brought in, I could make unrelated API calls, those would work fine. This esoteric thing that wasn't ready, that would have issues, but it would be scoped. And now we're proposing like expanding the impact of that one thing to the whole server, to the readiness. Like, there's absolutely things that used to work that will no longer work. And that's, to me, that's like the boundary. Like, is anyone who was working previously going to be broken by this? And the answer is yeah, maybe, probably, sometimes, yeah. That's the line in my view, like whether you start with opt-in and get evidence first.
And I'm realizing now my hand was up, but I was basically going to try to say the same thing, so I'm going to put that down.
So what I wrote in chat, like if we visualize this curve, maybe it's not an elbow, but it's a curve of like scariness versus, I don't know what the other axis is, honestly. But we can start to bracket what those criteria are, right? Like the way Jordan laid out. This is a bug. It has no observable impact. It might have implementation-driven impact, so it needs some mitigation. That's cool. We can start with that. Those could start in beta on by default, right? And it has no API footprint. Things with API footprint are clearly on the other side. They would be alpha off by default. This one is somewhat inside of that, where it has user visible impact but no API footprint. Can we then like refine the criteria incrementally through use cases to get to, these are the things that you should consider when you're deciding alpha, beta off, or beta on for the first state? Wojciech?
Yes, so that makes perfect sense to me. So I think that answers my question. I think I will follow up with David because I think that the risk here is smaller than we think, and maybe we should actually split it into two feature gates, but that's a separate discussion. I think I think we agree that beta but off by default might make sense here. We clearly the perception of the risk is, I think we are not aligned on that, but we should follow up on that offline. But I think I will figure it out with David. David,
so I have it open.
I'm
sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, David, does it make sense for you?
It does. I think beta and off by default, so that you have to turn it on, is something I am comfortable with. I'm fine with that. You expressed some concern that I would say I don't believe your evidence. I will say that your credit is good here, Wojtek. If you tell me that it works, I will believe that it works. But seeing that on like a shipped release and it's actually been tried and it's been tried over some reasonably long period, and ideally over a couple different sorts of clusters I think would be good and responsible in this case. If you do want to try to explore the separation, can we separate out those cases where it is like I'm changing a hang to a 429, those are a lot less concerning to me than I'm going to change the readiness state of a QAPI server, because I agree a hang to a 429 is like, it's objectively better. But it's
Yes,
something that you change to readiness that gives me significant pause.
yeah, so that absolutely makes sense, and like let's follow up on that. Like I think that like based on discussion, I think it's a little bit like related exactly to this cap, but like splitting it might make actually sense here, because I agree that risk here in those two somewhat separate changes is different here. But yeah, let's figure it out offline.
Okay.
So I was
and
working
then-
on a. Sorry, David. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I was just going to try to reply to your, like, where can we try to find that line? But you can go ahead, Tim.
Well, I was just going to say I have a PR pending where I've been trying to document a little bit more clearly when to use feature gates for what things, and it sort of hand waves right now at, well, sometimes depending on your reviewer, you'll start in beta. So like having better criteria for that, even if it's like guiding criteria and not like rigid, checklist criteria, would be super awesome. And honestly, the best way to explore that is probably through use cases. I also wanted to say, I wrote something like last year about alpha beta, and I haven't really had the energy to follow through on it. One of the things that I was thinking about there, though, was if we have the discipline in terms of getting features in people's hands sooner, if we have the discipline to say, in order to move from beta to GA, there must be 0 functional changes to your thing, right? And I'm not sure exactly how we measure that, but if we had that discipline, then when we're ready to move something to GA, we can sort of retroactively declare the last beta to be a viable release candidate, which means that providers like GKE could go back and turn that on because it's effectively GA, because there were 0 changes between the beta and the GA.
Yeah, for behavior things or things that aren't like endpoints. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And then we actually can get stuff into people's hands sooner, because we know there's a pipeline between when upstream cuts something and when a cloud adopts it and when the actual consumers of that cloud adopt it.
And obviously that wouldn't work for an API, but for pure behavior change. Yeah.
Correct.
Okay. So next steps then, Wojciech, you're going to follow up with David on this particular cap. And then are you going to, since you raised the topic, I think you're volunteering, you're going to maybe put something down. Like I like Jordan's criteria for a starting point, but maybe we can explore it further, like Tim was saying, as far as what this line is. Do you want to try to document some of that or put it in a little guiding in our contrib docs or somewhere?
Sure, I can definitely try, like,
okay,
not in the upcoming week or something, but
whatever,
yes, definitely,
whatever.
I'm happy to.
And then I think there's a third item, which is, I think we do still have this question of, is a feature gate too heavy? Is there something we want to do? And I think we've been literally for years talking about like alpha, beta, GA, how long it takes, and how we can experiment more effectively. We talked about it in KubeCon Contrib Summit. Like, it's a recurring topic, but hard to make progress on. But we probably need somebody to own that. I don't know if there's somebody in this call right now who's like, I want to take the charge on that, or everybody's too constrained and busy with other things. But I feel like there's a velocity problem here, and a rollout problem here that we probably need to spend some time on. I think, Tim, your hand's stale, but David raised a hand.
I popped mine up. I was not volunteering to write that, but I was saying that in many cases where I'm looking at feature gates and we need some kind of mitigation method, a feature gate already being plumbed through, already being globally accessible, being something you can drop in as a global into any package where you need to use it is. I'm surprised that's being considered as heavy compared to the possible alternatives. And I wonder if heavy in this case is code for I want to become on by default faster. And and help me find a way to do that versus it's actually difficult to do.
I think it's less about
uh,
difficult. I think it's more about the breadth of impact in changing a gate. You can't say, let me just try it. Like if I could turn a gate on just for a namespace, I'll go throw some test workloads into this namespace and see if they perform according to some criteria that only I can know, without putting the rest of my cluster at risk. Would that be interesting? Maybe. As a feature developer, I find it incredibly difficult to get people to try stuff if it's not on by default, because it's such a big change.
People need to create a new cluster, right? So effectively, right? So that might be too high of a burden for our users to experiment with a feature. That's the question. Maybe it's not. I mean, maybe that's just, we just need to work harder at getting them to do it.
So
I think features are wildly non-homogeneous in terms of their blast radius. And so some, it's like, it doesn't matter if you constrained it to a namespace. If the controller goes bananas, like your whole cluster's toast anyway. And some like networking things, it's like there's not a great boundary for like, how would you like your network to be broken from some people's view and not like, and so first of all, like a separate like orthogonal experiment thing is gonna add complexity, and I feel like we're already struggling with complexity, and so just adding more complexity, I think, is net negative out of the gate. And then if there is a mechanism for like, you wouldn't normally be able to be on by default, but actually you can opt into being on by default, I think people will abuse that to start getting things enabled before they should. Like when they really legitimately should have been in an opt-in phase and haven't thought through all the ways that being partially enabled could actually degrade the whole cluster. I'm just a very pessimistic person.
David.
Going in a slightly different direction, though I'm also a pessimistic person, more optimistic than Jordan. I do wonder whether some of the difficulty that we're having in people aren't trying a thing is that their means of actually installing Cube these days is no longer, I'm running it myself, I'll set my feature gate so I want because I want to try this new feature. Instead, the vast majority are using either a cloud provider like GKE, where you guys have an opinion about what's enabled, or a vendor like OpenShift and Red Hat, where we say, nope, this is the set that you're going to use. And we do offer, I think both of us and most vendors offer go ahead and try these new features if you want. But maybe upgrades won't work, or maybe we will end your cluster after so many days because you can try it, but we aren't sure that it's going to have a future, so we aren't going to put commercial support behind it. I don't think that we would fix that situation by trying to expose the ability to turn something on independently. Like you can imagine, what if we made an API that allowed you to turn this experimental feature on? Well, I think the very first thing that many vendors would do is to shut down that endpoint and say, well, you can't do that.
Just because supporting things with experimental features is like, you can't support it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but I think many of us would reach that conclusion.
So my point, it was more what Tim is saying here. Like we need somebody to own and lead this problem we have of we don't get enough feedback. There's multiple problems. We don't get enough feedback, which means that we move too slowly through, like there's a high latency between the conception of a feature and delivery to customers' hands, right? It's quite a high latency of like 18 months typically, right? Especially when you consider the pipeline from open source to commercial customers. So like, what can we do about that? And so those are, and what we're talking about are different aspects of it, and like, oh, well, we can, in different ideas, but like, I'd love it if somebody put it out there again, can like take that on as a, hey, this is a problem we need to solve. I'm going to focus on it. I'm going to solicit feedback, and we're going to put together a CAP that describes policy changes, whether maybe there's not a single line of code to be written. Maybe it's just the way we do policy. Maybe it's just talk to Contribax and say, hey, we need you to help us engage with customers, who want to use these things. Or maybe it's talk to the people sponsoring who build the features that like, hey, you want to get this feature in, we require, actual users to have used it. And so they're going to have to put effort into going out and working with individual customers to make it happen. Like this is something I mentioned at the Contrib Summit. Like all of us in our internal stuff, we have product managers, and what do product managers do is they talk to customers and they get customers to sign up for previews of features that aren't publicly available yet and give feedback on them. And like, do we need similar mechanisms or supporting mechanisms in the open source community? So I'm open personally to all of these ideas, but I do think we have a problem. And I'm hoping that there's somebody who's interested and willing to take the lead on solving that problem. But I'm hearing crickets. So.
I mean, I started in thinking about that alpha beta life cycle stuff, and it's such a deep well that I ran out of rope to keep lowering the bucket. Like I just don't have the time for it.
We all have a lot of stuff to do. Yeah.
I think it's a real problem, and I think it's an interesting problem. And I think it requires, the sort of context that the people on this call have. But it's also probably a multi-year project.
Yes, it certainly is. Okay, well, I'll put it out there anyway, and maybe if I actually upload the recording this time, somebody will have a mystical, magical unicorn out there that comes in and saves the day. But other than that, I think we're done with the agenda. So do we want to adjourn here? Is there anything else that people need to raise?
I put on the agenda for future the idea of deprecations and stuff, but I don't think we have enough time to do that justice here today. And I apologize for not having moved it to the regular agenda. I wasn't sure I was going to be able to attend today. So I'll leave it for future and try to put it on the main agenda in an upcoming meeting.
Okay, awesome. All right, thank you, everybody. Have a great day.